Hey everyone, welcome back to my next video in a series of videos that I created on general and medical fitness. In the last one I covered how I set up resistance training programs within the scope of a session, how each session fits into the scope of a week, how each week fits into the scope of a phase, and how each phase fits within the scope of a cycle. And I also covered some important concepts on return on investment, or in other words, how to ensure that the intensity of each set is safe and yet still high enough that you're going to get the benefits of resistance training. In this video, I'll give a general overview of the variables that are involved in designing a resistance training program, such as frequency, sets, repetitions per set, rest periods between sets, order of exercise, choice of exercise, and so on. But first I need to explain the strength and endurance continuum. Our muscles have two different types of fibers, strength fibers and endurance fibers. And because of that, there's a strength and endurance continuum, which means that when you're exercising or training for either strength, endurance, or as you can see here, there's a middle ground known as local muscle endurance or strength endurance. The repetition range you work out in determines how your body is going to respond and adapt to the load that you're lifting. So in the 1 to 3 repetition range, and by the way, this is assuming that you're choosing loads where you're taking yourself to at or very near muscle failure. And by very near, I mean that if you don't take yourself to muscle failure, then you're terminating sets where you could have only performed another 2, 3, or probably at the most 4 more repetitions. So assuming that that's the case, then in the 1 to 3 repetition range, you're lifting very heavy weight and your body will respond for what's called maximum power or very heavy strength. In the 4 to 6 repetition range, you're lifting heavy weight and your body will respond for what's called heavy strength. In the 6 to 12 repetition range, you're now lifting moderate weight and your body will respond for moderate strength, or this is classically known as a hypertrophy or muscle growth range, but I covered that in a little bit more detail in the last video that I created. And once you get up here in the 12 to 20 repetition range, the loads are such that you're now starting to lift light and very light weight. And the way your body responds, you may have an effect on your strength. It really kind of depends on where your strength level is. So in other words, the weaker you are, the more likely it is that lifting in these repetition range will have an effect on your strength. But as your strength increases, then lifting light to very light weights will not have an effect on your strength or will have very little, and it becomes much more important that you start to shift down here into spending most but not necessarily all of your time in the 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 repetition range. There needs to be a cutoff to make a distinction as to whether or not you're training for strength or endurance, and for most people that cutoff is right around 20 repetitions per set. It can get a little murky depending on your fitness level and how strong you are to begin with. But generally speaking, the strength part of the strength and endurance continuum is the 1 to 20 repetition range. So before I get into the slides where I start breaking down the different variables involved in designing a resistance training program and giving them more clarity, I just want to quickly go over the definition of strength and some related concepts. The NSCA, which is the National Strength and Conditioning Association, the primary governing body in strength and conditioning, defines strength as the maximum force that a muscle group can produce at a specified velocity, or in other words, it's your 1 repetition maximum. And what this means is that in order to increase your strength, you need to increase your 1 RM. And you can't objectively know this unless you're occasionally either testing your 1 RM or at the very least like a 3, 4, or 5 repetition maximum to get so that you can have a sense as to whether or not your strength increased. Once you get out of a beginner range of strength, which really if you're on a proper resistance training program shouldn't take more than several months, you don't necessarily want to spend all your time in the 4 to 12 repetition range, but you want to start shifting things down and spending most of your time in the 4 to 12 repetition range, because you aren't going to get stronger lifting in the higher repetition range. As I noted in the previous slide, once you're up in the 15 to 20 range, lifting with light and very light weights. So while those repetition ranges definitely serve a purpose, in order to get stronger, you're eventually going to have to start shifting things down to lower repetition ranges and working with heavier weights. And that leads to this last bullet point, A primary purpose of strength training is to become stronger. The reason why I say that is because there's so many people at the gym who lift weights that are too light, don't take themselves to at or near muscle failure, and are really honestly just wasting their time in the gym for the most part, because what's going to happen is your body's going to adapt, you're going to plateau, things are going to get stale because you're not progressing, and before you know it, you're going to quit. When the truth is, if you train primarily in the 4 to 12 repetition range and you are taking yourself to at or near muscle failure, you're going to continue to progress for years and years on end. All right, so now we'll start breaking down the different variables involved in designing a resistance training program. First up is frequency. The governing body guidelines are to train every major muscle group in your body 2 to 3 times a week. It takes about 24 to 72 hours for a muscle group to recover from a resistance training program. What's going to determine how long it takes primarily is how high the volume is, how high the intensity is of a workout, and also where you lie on a fitness level. So the lower your fitness level, the longer it may take to recover depending on the volume and intensity of the workout. And the more fit you are, typically you'll recover faster. But the bottom line is that it usually takes about 24 to 48 hours. And because of that, if you do the math, you can train every major muscle group in your body 2 to 3 times a week. If a person only has the time and desire to train 2 or 3 times a week, then their sessions should be total body sessions, because that's how you hit every major muscle group in your body 2 to 3 times a week. Or another way you could go about it would be to do one total body in 2 split routines. Like for example, doing a lower body on Saturday, an upper body on Sunday, and then a total body on like a Tuesday or a Wednesday. This could be beneficial mentally because some people just don't want to train their whole body every single session, and it's mentally relaxing knowing that you can go into a session where you're only training part of the body. And another advantage to this is that on the days where you're just training part of your body, you actually can put in some more volume, which means that your total weekly volume may be a little bit higher by doing it this way. And then if the individual has the time and desire to train 4 to 6 times per week, that's when you really want to split things up. And for example, train lower body twice a week and upper body twice a week. Next up is intensity. There are 2 types of intensity. I pretty much already covered this in a previous slide, but the gist of this is that objectively speaking, where you're taking your feelings and your rate of perceived exertion out of the equation as though it doesn't even exist, on the strength continuum, which once again runs from 1 to about 20 repetitions, objectively, the 1 to 3 repetition range is very heavyweight. The 15 to 20 repetition range, you're lifting very lightweight, and then you have everything in between. So very heavy, heavy, moderate, light, and very lightweight. But this is assuming that you're loading up so that you're taking sets to at or near muscle failure. Subjective intensity I covered in my previous video, so I'll go over this fairly quickly. The important thing to remember is that we need to merge 3 concepts: rate of perceived exertion, or in other words, how much effort you're putting into each set, the movement velocity, or in other words, the speed of movement of each repetition, and repetitions in reserve, or in other words, if you terminate a set prior to muscle failure, how many repetitions you left in reserve at the end of the set. So now I'll give that more clarity. A set's going to fall into one of 2 categories. It's either going to be a warm-up set or a working set, and we need to make a distinction as to which category it falls into. On a scale of 1 to 10, a 1 to 6 is considered a warm-up set, and a 7 to 10 is considered a working set. So working backwards, a 10 on the scale of 1 to 10 means that you took yourself to muscle failure, you put in maximum effort, there were no repetitions in reserve because fatigue determined that the set was over with, and there was a complete stop in the movement. A 9 means that you terminated the set knowing that you had 1 or in some cases 2 repetitions in reserve, and the movement almost came to a stop. An 8 means you terminated the set knowing that you had 2 or in some cases 3 repetitions in reserve, and the slowing was increasing. And the 7 means you terminated the set with 3 or sometimes 4 repetitions in reserve, and the slowing was in its early stage. But the main point of all this is that if the velocity of movement has slowed, then it was a true working set because neuromuscular fatigue has truly kicked in. If the speed of the last repetition of a set was the same as every repetition that preceded it, then it was a warm-up. And if your goal was for it to be a working set, then you need to increase the load, or your body has little to nothing to adapt to and you're not going to get the benefits of resistance training. So the merging of rate of perceived exertion, or in other words, how much effort you're putting into the set, repetitions in reserve, or in other words, how close you're taking yourself to muscle failure, and the velocity of movement are really important concepts to understand. The main point I want to make about choice of exercise is that it falls into one of two categories. It was either a primary movement, such as what you see on this list, and if an exercise doesn't fall into the category of a primary movement, then by definition, it was an assistance or corrective exercise. Some examples would be hip strengthening exercises, such as strengthening your adductors and abductors, calves, low and mid trapezius, your rotator cuff. But there are a countless amount of exercises that fall into the assistance or corrective category. And one of the important things to get across in this slide is that there are many people who spend too much time designing programs around assistance and corrective exercises, such as burpees, Turkish get-ups, Airex pad, Bosu ball, and Dynadisc exercises, TheraBands, doing things like scapular stabilization, or really emphasizing core strengthening, serratus anterior strengthening, and things like that. And while assistance and corrective exercises are better than doing nothing, and while they are a means to an end as far as improving joint pain, if you're spending your time revolving programs around assistance and corrective exercises at the expense of including your primary exercises like squats and deadlifts, push, pull, and press, then your program is not going to be nearly as efficient or effective. And a much better approach in most cases is to design your program around the primary movements and include assistance and corrective exercises as needed. It's a better means to an end because not only are you going to prevent and manage joint pain, but you're going to significantly improve strength as well. When it comes to order of exercise within a session, the general guidelines are that you want to move from most important to least important, explosive before non-explosive, large to small, complex to simple, and multi-joint to single joint. And the way that manifests itself at a total body training session is that if you're going to include explosive exercises after your warm-up, that's what you want to begin with. And then from there, you would move to multi-joint legs, such as your squats, deads, hip thrust, and lunge variations. Your back and your chest are your next two largest muscle groups. And then from there, you can move to your smaller muscle groups like frontal plane strengthening for your hips, your adductors and your abductors. If you have access to knee extension and knee curl machine, you should include those, and then calves and shoulders. So that's how order of exercise manifests itself within a total body training session. On the topic of sets per muscle group, this is really tough because it's such an it depends situation. It depends on how much time and desire you have, because for those who only want to spend 20 or 30 minutes in the gym, it's going to significantly reduce how many sets they can perform per muscle group. Other things that are going to determine sets per muscle group are things like where you fall in the fitness continuum. For example, people who are weaker or have a lower level of strength shouldn't be performing high volume of sets per muscle group because they're going to be so sore they're not going to be able to move the next day. And those who are stronger and more fit may need to perform more sets per muscle group depending on, once again, their time and desire and what their goal is. But from a general fitness and medical fitness standpoint, 10 sets per muscle group per week for your three large muscle groups, your legs, back, and chest, is a good goal to try to reach or exceed. So please keep that in mind when you're designing resistance training programs for yourself or for clients. And part of the reason why I say this is because in the fitness industry, where a lot of times you're only training clients once or twice per week, it can actually be pretty difficult to reach 10 sets per muscle group per week. And it becomes that much more important to either give them homework to do on their own or to make the sessions more efficient and effective by not spending too much time on assistance in corrective exercises and smaller muscle groups so that you can get your weekly volume in for your larger muscle groups. And a huge reason why is because if you get less than 10 sets per muscle group in per week, it's going to make it difficult for most people to get out of a beginner range of strength, and to get the benefits of strength training and improve your health, your fitness, prevent injuries, prevent joint pain, or manage joint pain if you have it, is to get out of a beginner range of strength. And another important thing to understand is that if your goal is hypertrophy, or in other words, increasing lean muscle tissue, then your volume is most likely going to have to be higher, because volume is a primary driver of hypertrophy, which means at some point, depending on how much you want to increase lean muscle tissue, you're probably going to have to include more than 10 sets per muscle group per week for your 3 large muscle groups. But if your primary goal is strength, when it comes to general and medical fitness, 10 sets per muscle group per week is probably sufficient for most people. But sets per muscle group per week also depends on the ability to recover and recuperate. And genetics plays a big role in this, your sleep, your nutrition and eating habits, overall stress, supplements, experience, among other things. So when it comes to sets per muscle group, it can get pretty murky, and the primary thing for general medical fitness is the 10 sets per muscle group per week concept. Repetitions per set can also be a murky situation because there are so many it depends variables, but generally speaking, what I do with the majority of my clients is start with a familiarization phase. I typically begin around 10 repetitions per set. I almost never begin higher, and sometimes I'll begin lower if their conditioning is so low that 10 repetitions is going to take them to at or near muscle failure. And the reason why it's called a familiarization phase is because the purpose of the phase is to teach proper form, names of exercises, flow of a session, and to help establish a mind-body connection. But once you move out of the familiarization phase, at this point you want to begin periodization. And typically what I'll do is move clients from 10 repetitions per set up to 12 to 15 repetitions per set. I'll keep them there for a 2 to 4 week phase. And the goal is to increase strength during the phase so that at the end of the phase, for instance, if it was 4 weeks in length, we want to make sure that in every exercise for their main muscle groups, legs, back, chest, calves, and shoulders, that they were a little bit stronger at the end of the phase than they were in the beginning. And then what that does is prepare the body when you move to the next phase, which is where you would drop 2 repetitions to the 10 to 12 repetitions per set range. You keep them there for a 2 to 4 week phase. And once again, the goal is to increase strength during the phase so that by the end of the phase, they're a little stronger in each exercise than they were at the beginning of the phase. And then we move to 8 to 10 repetitions per set. We do the same thing, and then 6 to 8 repetitions per set with the same goal in mind. At this point, you may want to schedule in an active rest period where you either significantly decrease volume and intensity, or maybe take a week or 2 off from resistance training in general to allow their body to recover and recuperate from the 4 phases that they just went through. And then in this linear model that I'm describing, you would swing back around to 12 to 15 and repeat the process again. And what will happen is that the next time around, they're going to be stronger in each phase than they were the first time cycling through these repetition ranges. And then depending on the situation, you may want to think about shifting them down to the 4 to 12 repetition range, where you may spend some time up above 12 repetitions, but spend most of your time in the 4 to 12 repetition range lifting heavier weights for slightly fewer repetitions. So this can definitely vary from person to person, but this is a general idea of how to set up a repetitions per set scheme for both general and medical fitness. On the topic of rest periods between sets, as I pull up these first 2 bullet points, you'll see that the guidelines are that you rest within a range. And what that really means is that the longer end applies more for your larger muscle groups because they take longer to recover. And the shorter end of the range applies more to your smaller muscle groups like calves and shoulders because they don't take as long to recover. But when you're in the higher repetition ranges like 12 to 20 repetitions per set, where the adaptation that's occurring is primarily local muscle endurance or strength endurance, you actually want your rest periods to be fairly short because you're asking your body to respond for local muscle endurance and you want to force it to have to adapt to fatigue. But as you start moving down in repetition ranges and you're moving away from endurance and towards strength and maximum power, you want to start to increase your rest periods between sets so that in the 8 to 12 repetition range, it starts to become 90 seconds for your smaller muscle groups and 2 to 3 minutes for your larger muscle groups. In the 4 to 8 repetition range, it's more like 3 to 5 minutes, and in the 1 to 4 repetition range, it's in the 5 to 7 minute range. And as rest periods between sets become longer, in order to be time efficient, you can begin supersetting, or in other words, going back and forth between two separate muscle groups, or tri-setting as you get down into the 1 to 4 or maybe even the 1 to 6 repetition range, where you might perform legs, back, and chest, and then head back to hit legs again, because by the time you do that, usually a good 5 to 7 minutes have gone by. But having said all that, in medical fitness where the person has chronic disease and or orthopedic issues, and especially when I'm first starting with them, I honestly pretty much throw all this out the window because it becomes an it depends situation since they have one or more conditions. And I'll usually allow them to rest until they're psychologically ready to perform the next set and when their heart and breathing rate come back to at or near a resting level. So it's really important to understand that if you yourself or your client suffers from chronic disease or orthopedic issues, that while these are good general guidelines, you want to keep this in mind too. And the reason why I say this is because so many times I see in the gym trainers who are just pushing their clients too hard. They hardly let them rest between sets at all. You can totally see that the client is not mentally ready to perform the next set. And the trainer thinks it's a good thing to push, when many times it's not a good thing at all. But once we've set a foundation of fitness level, then I will start bringing this stuff back into play, especially when they're up here in some of these higher repetition ranges where I do want their heart rate up a little bit from set to set to force them to have to adapt to fatigue a little bit. With tempo, when I first start with a client, during the familiarization phase, I'm actually just trying to develop mind-body connections, teach them names of exercises in proper form and things like that. So I'm not overly concerned with tempo other than to make sure that they're controlling the loads. But once we get out of the familiarization phase, it's really important to start cueing them to lift with velocity, or at the very least the intent of velocity, and lower the weight with control. I'm not a big fan of timing the lowering or eccentric portion of the movement like a lot of people do. I know their reasoning behind that is to lengthen the eccentric portion of the movement in order to improve stability. But the truth is that improving stability has a lot more to do with just the eccentric portion of the movement. It also has to do with overall strength, isometric contractions, strength endurance, and other variables. So my view is that while the eccentric or lowering portion of the movement is really important, it doesn't necessarily need to be timed. We just need to make sure that the lowering portion is being controlled. And then finally, on the topic of breathing, the most important things to understand is that you want to exhale during the lifting or concentric portion of a movement. You want to inhale during the lowering or eccentric portion of a movement. We want to avoid extended Valsalva maneuver. And what Valsalva means is that not only are you holding your breath, but more specifically, you're holding your breath where your glottis, the flap that covers your throat, has been closed. Because when that happens, then that's when you increase intrathoracic pressure, which significantly increases blood pressure, and in some situations can be dangerous. But the truth is that when you're in the 1 to 8 repetition range, it's pretty much impossible to avoid Valsalva. It's actually a strategy your body uses as a way to increase stability. So in that case, the main thing to understand is that if Valsalva does occur, you want to keep it to 2 seconds or less. And finally, I know that there's a view out there that diaphragmatic breathing is really important, but there isn't quality data that supports that, at least not when it comes to reducing joint pain, preventing injury, or improving motor control. I'm not discounting the importance of diaphragmatic breathing when it comes to things like lung disease, such as COPD, pulmonary hypertension. It definitely has benefits when it comes to endurance training, but I'm a major skeptic when it comes to the importance of diaphragmatic breathing for pretty much anything else. And that pretty much wraps it up for this video. In the next one, I'll cover clinical assessment concepts and how I go about performing the initial assessment. But thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.